very good English, so yes, it was
Nice to
enjoyable.
meet. So how did you make the connection from studying finance to biologic architecture?
Well, it's just being curious about everything, what's happening in the world, and trying to connect the dots, because I think everything is interconnected, and it's important to be aware about various aspects. And as a human beings, we're all influenced by different energies, different thoughts. So it's always interesting to see how factors actually affect us as a human beings. And as you know that everything in our world is not dead, it's all alive and all has movement. So yes.
Great. Well, wonderful. So I'm ready for, you have a list of questions, or how shall we do this? You want to do an introduce, right? Yes?
Yes. So I will explain shortly. We would like to make it as official interview. So we'll start with the greetings. I will tell a few words about you. I will introduce you. And then we will start asking you questions. So me or Taliy will take turns in asking question. In the meantime, when you answering your question, you will notice that we will be switching our microphones just to make sure that the sound of your speech is perfect and not disturbed by any background noise. So don't be disturbed that it will be muted, our microphones. We're very carefully listening to you. Yes, and if you can answer them openly, so that in case we need to cut a part of your answer, so that we don't need to add a question, so it would be like a full answer, without requirement of adding a question.
Sure, I'm sure we'll have fun. Let's do it. Go ahead. Great smile. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. Oh, yes, Valerie is asking us to wait a little bit.
Okay, sure. Mm-hmm. So is biologic architecture a theme of your YouTube channel as well?
We actually every month we are making broadcast of Kaleidoscope of Facts, and we on each Kaleidoscope of Facts, it's like a show. We actually selecting various topics for the discussion.
Kaleidoscope
of Facts.
A kaleidoscope of facts. I see. Well, a kaleidoscope is like a rainbow, which obviously is fractal or harmonic inclusive, potentially. I guess that fits.
Yes, indeed. So, and on this, let's say, broadcast, we're actually discussing various topics, and this would be the 27th or 28th episode. But if you go on our YouTube channel, you can actually see the whole playlist. I will share with you the link to it, and you can see that we are covering various topics, and they're not really related. Like one is not really specifically related to another, but they're all interconnected with each other. So it's yes, and the idea is that all the volunteers from all around the world, they actually getting in touch with scientists and discussing various topics, asking questions and going more in depth on specific topics. So it's we're trying to really bring scientific potential inside to really give the interesting information to people who can benefit. So if they're, for example, interested about pyramids, they can easily find the episode about pyramids and they can watch it and go in depth, take the in-depth information. It's like a encyclopedia on one specific topic. So
I see. Great. We just did a program on the physics of pyramids. All good.
Great, very interesting. May I maybe I would like to tell about you in this way. Shall I tell it right now, and you correct me if there's anything that I need to remove or to add? Yes.
Sure. Go ahead.
So Dan Winter from Fractal University is the author of numerous publications and books on gravitational energy, emotions, the evolution of consciousness, and sacred geometry. He graduated with honors from the University of Detroit. He pursued graduate studies in psychophysiology and the origin of languages. He has undertaken many diverse studies from quantum physics to modeling at the MIT Space Lab to developing the early biofeedback prototype equipment as a Dr. Albert X protege.
Yeah, I was the electrical engineer of the psychophysiology lab. We built polygraphs and we measured the electrical differences between emotions.
Oh, wow. Would you like me to add this?
No, that's okay. That's okay. Go ahead.
But you can also add this as after my introduction. I think it would be a very nice addition.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah. So were you going to read more or?
Oh, Valeria is already saying that we can start. So this was my introduction about you. May I say this way?
Yes, no, it's fine. I mean, basically, the graduate work in psychophysiology, after that, I was a systems analyst with IBM. And then I ran an electrical engineering motor and generator lab in Buffalo, New York for many years. And then I taught physics of consciousness internationally for over 20 years, and currently develop inventions around implosion and biofeedback like flameinmind.com and therify.net, which is a life force administering plasma, therify.net. And this relates to biologic architecture specifically in the sense that we're going to talk about how you accrete or implode charge. And that's the key point of biologic architecture.
Wow. May we start and you add this information?
Sure.
Yes,
Go ahead.
Please. It would be very interesting to have this addition. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Dear viewers, welcome to our program. Today we have an interview with very interesting person, Dan Winter. Let me introduce him. Dan Winter is from Fractal University. He's as author of numerous publications and books on gravitational energy, emotions, the evolution of consciousness, and sacred geometry. Dan Winter graduated with honors from the University of Detroit. He pursued graduate studies in psychophysiology and the origin of languages. He has undertaken many diverse studies, from quantum physics to modeling at the MIT Space Lab to developing the early biofeedback prototype equipment as Dr. Albert X protege. Greetings, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. And if you would like to add something to your bio, because I know you've been running a lab in Buffalo and so on, what have you been doing lately? Could you tell us a little bit more about
Yes, my vitae is at goldenmean.info/vitae. It's true that after graduate work in psychophysiology, I was a systems analyst with IBM. And then I worked in electrical engineering, motor and generator at SS Electric in Buffalo for many years. I was the troubleshooter in a generator, and I began to do lectures on electrical hygiene actually at that time. And then I helped found Gaia TV. I co-founded a community in North Carolina, Circle of Life. And then I was invited to do world lectures, initially with Flower of Life, mostly on physics of consciousness and physics of feng shui, which I did for 20 or so years around the world, too many times. And then became focused on the technologies that prove the point of the physics of consciousness around the concept of implosion, like brainwave implosion of bliss, flameinmind.com, and water implosion, theimploder.com, and now the therify.net, a plasma implosion rejuvenation in use in 25 countries. And so we're deep and heavy into the tech where the physics of consciousness meets the technology, where you can really put into practice the science of life force, which is behind the concept of biologic architecture and today's conversation.
Thank you so much for this addition. Very fascinating, all your life road. And now it leads to our first question. Could you please tell us what is the biological architecture? What are the characteristics of biological architecture?
Yeah, biologic architecture is probably a useful term, but actually, if that were put in terms of pure science, it merely points toward the principle of how you accrete or attract or implode living charge in structures. So, for example, a living cell is obviously biologic architecture. And what makes the living cell alive is its ability to implode or attract charge. Another practical example would be the difference between a seed that's going to germinate and one that is not, is the seed that chooses to germinate is one that's able to implode, attract charge, and therefore suck in its first nutrient. So life force actually sucks. and that implosion or suction of charge literally and precisely defines living architecture. So we use the term biologic in front of architecture because generally we think of that as applying to the choice, for example, of biologic materials and biologic dimensions. But even that term, biologic in the sense of materials, actually only points to the more important physics, which is that cells and material that were once part of life have generally reorganized their geometry to be more what is called fractal or self-similar. And that is not subjective, that is measured in terms of what's called dielectric constant, which is a measure in electrical engineering of how efficiently a material distributes charge and therefore makes a capacitor work. And so the technical term for a living building is an implosive capacitor, actually. So the reason we call it biologic architecture is because we're pointing to the fact that if you choose the right biologic materials, you get a dielectric constant, which allows your aura to breathe, literally, capacitance to breathe. So if you stick your hand in an aluminum box, it feels dead. If you stick your hand in a box made of, say, limestone or living wood, it feels alive. And that difference, ability to breathe charge efficiently, is the essence, the core of the physics of why we call it biologic architecture. And then further, so you have a whole chart of appropriate material for biologic architecture, all at goldenmean.info/architecture, and maybe we bring that up later, which is, that certain kinds of wood, hardwood, for example, are a little better than softwood because the finer grain makes a better capacitor, et cetera, et cetera. And the choice of metals is very tricky because most metals will destroy the capacitance of the aura of your child. Do not go to school in a steel box because your aura is going to crash. It's very simple. So, and the second aspect then of biological architecture is choosing dimensions whose wavelength will allow charge to implode. And that is the only definition of sacred dimensioning, literally sacred scales, sacred units. And for example, our friend John Michel spent his life trying to prove that the British foot was more sacred than the damn European meter. and he was really right, but he didn't understand the physics. I was going to want to, can I do a share screen here? I don't see share screen. I was going to show that slide. But basically what it is you can prove that the British foot is sacred because if you take the Planck length, which is a dimension that allows charge collapse, implosion, and you multiply by powers integer exponents of golden mean ratio, that is a caduceus cascade called the only definition of fractality, that allows implosive charge collapse. And implosive charge collapse is the only thing that makes the charge centripetal enough to implode and make life. So the reason we talk about sacred dimensions is only because we'd like to learn how to make charge collapse implosively and therefore negentropic. So these are whole fields which relate to the concept of biologic architecture, dimension, and materials. But it is ultimately physics and science, and it's a pure physics and science of what makes charge implode and therefore makes life.
That sounds fascinating, and thank you for sharing it with us. And how did you originally come up to studying this topic, and what inspired you to do this?
Well, actually, as I was teaching physics of consciousness in about 25 different countries around the world every year for 20 years, oh my God, and I'm still young, almost. So we were trying to teach the physics of consciousness, and the hygiene for the physics of consciousness, being an electrical engineer, which is my field, includes basic things like the movement to attract charge, and then the space, the structure to attract charge. So for many years, we were trying to teach people how to do what Carlos Castaneda said, which was Find your place of power. And he said, the place of power in a room is the place from which your aura gets leverage, implodes. And so that begins a thinking process which says, gee, we need to understand what makes a place of power. And that's the definition of biologic architecture, that implosion. And so from that perspective, the geometry of sacred space is basically the geometry of charge implosion. Actually, I found my slide share thing here. Let's see if we can do some graphics just to, so are you seeing my screen here?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So here is that chart. This is the definition of sacred dimension, why certain lengths make sacred dimension. The only reason, the only definition of sacred is the ability to implode charge and make space fractal and therefore negentropic and implosive, a vortex. And so the reason you choose a dimension is to implode charge. It turns out when John Michel prepared this chart of the origin of sacred dimension, and he showed that everything is based on the British foot. You see the Roman pace, megalithic yard, Palestinian cubic, royal cubic, and even the Teotihuacan unit of the Mexican pyramids. They're all based on pure geometric implosion to the British foot. So there's John Michel dedicating his life to show that these damn Europeans, having picked out the meter, screwed up. And he wanted to say, no, if you want to do sacred metrology, you need to be British. I mean, you need the foot. Well, actually, John Michel, he's a hero, and I sponsored his lecture tours, Dimensions of Paradise, City of Revelation, View over Atlantis, many books. He actually was correct with the logic, but he didn't get the physics. The physics is because the British foot, if you take the golden ratio right here, if you take the Planck length times golden ratio to integer exponents, 164 powers, exactly, you get 0.9964 feet. So the foot is a wavelength which allows charge to implode in a perfect caduceus fractal cascade to Planck. So if you take multiples of the British foot, you're more likely to implode. And that's why all these units of dimension are sacred, because they're tuned to implosion. That's the point I was going to make. So in this whole curriculum for biologic architecture, this is the website goldenmean.info/architecture, where we developed this curriculum. This is, for example, how we measured sacred space using the GDV, gas discharge visualization. Let me go back there. So if you take and measure the fractality of the air in a sacred building, you get charge distribution efficiency. These pictures here of a capacitor able to unpack. Whereas here in the GDV, this is a probe measuring how easy it is for a spark to propagate, like your child's soul. And on the left, you have what happens in a metal building. Oh shit, the spark has no place to go. Oh my. So that difference between charge distribution efficiency and charge distribution trapped is the only definition actually of living architecture, and it's measurable. And so we turned that into a curriculum where we actually, and this is our team here at bioarchitects.net, where this team is a global team of many bioarchitects that all have focused around this curriculum. This was the curriculum that I founded in our first international conference of 3 at the University in Mexico. And here is the point, is that if you build life force, you can measure the harmonics of charge, harmonic inclusiveness capacitance, and then predict which building will cause a seed to grow and a child, and therefore which architect should get a paycheck. That simply. That means architects that put your children in steel and aluminum boxes do not deserve a paycheck, and we can prove it.
Извините, пожалуйста. Сейчас, вот, когда гость показывает картинки, то гостя не видно.
Oh, so then when you show in the pictures, it's actually blocking your screen, so we cannot see you. So once, yeah, we prefer to see, to see you after this speech.
Sorry. Yes, you're right. My smiling face. I'm here.
Exactly. So you mentioned that you was just doing some work on pyramids as well, right?
Yes. The recent film we made on the only physics of the reason pyramids exist is if you take the pyramid dimension and you measure it, it's obviously a geometry which allows implosive capacitive resonance with the Schumann harmonics. Now, the Schumann harmonics are a harmonic cascade, which again, 7.8 hertz, 1330, that harmonic cascade of the Schumann is a very close approximation of golden ratio times Planck. So actually catching the Schumann harmonics is only an introduction to the physics of catching charge implosion in general. The reason Gaia is negentropic and mindful. And so the film we made basically showed that we made it with Sam Osmanagic, the Bosnian pyramid, and you'll find it on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Dan Winter Fractal Field, 300 films, 2 million views. And on that film, we documented that after we traveled to the Bosnian pyramid and measured the 53 hertz there, as we did in dozens of other sacred sites, and then Sam showed us that his measurements at the top of that pyramid, 28 kilohertz, were replicated many times. And we showed by equation why the measured frequency of the Bosnian pyramid and other great pyramids are all the same. They're a harmonic cascade that starts with Schumann famous 7.83 hertz. And then you have the 53 and all the way up to 28 kilohertz, because that is imploding charge. It's called longitudinal interferometry, because when that implosion completes, it spits out a coherent longitudinal, or sometimes called scalar wave, at the Planck threshold, and that travels around the planet in an array, which is the only definition and possibility of global wireless power, which was the reason pyramids were built. And we even showed in detail that because the actual Schumann is 7.83 hertz, instead of 7.29, which would be accurately golden ratio to Planck. So when Hermes designed the Earth, he got the Schumann harmonics close, but not precise. So 7.83 hertz instead of 7.29 hertz, the actual versus the theoretical Schumann. If you use golden ratio, you get to 53 instead of 50 hertz, and then you get to 28 kilohertz instead of 26.7, which is actually predictive of all the measurements made. So we know precisely why the pyramids are making the frequencies they do, because they need to implode. And that implosion causes a seed to germinate. It's actually able to, it makes your aura plasma projective. It gets to the next question where we're talking about why an egg instead of a sphere, because in the center, that implosion causes the plasma projection called raising of the Jed, as in Jedi Knight, and why, for example, Osiris was able to use it as a squirt gun into Orion, actually, which is another story. So that film is quite detailed on the subject of the physics of pyramids, which is basically not just to create life force and not just as a pump for water, which it was, but also as a gravity diode to enable longitudinal interferometry, the only definition of global wireless power. And incidentally, Tesla got that wrong because he didn't have the frequencies right, and he didn't get the nodal positions correct.
Wow. We had an interview with Sam Osmanagic on our channel, and he was participating in preparation of Kaleidoscope of facts about the pyramids. So it's great to see that we connect into more and more people who are doing research on this topic.
Sam was great, and he's done a lot of measurements, and we made sense of the measurement to show how they fit into the equation. Sam's an old friend. He's great.
That's awesome. Why do you think those who build the pyramids used specifically this shape, the shape of a pyramid, for their structures?
Well, obviously, it's half an octahedron, and the octahedral geometry in physics is called phase conjugation. That's how you make waves conjugate or implode, the only origin of negentropy and self-organization. But now, if you demodulate the vertical the height of that pyramid to incorporate golden ratio into the height versus the dimensions of the base, then you create phase conjugate implosion. So you actually shorten the height of the pyramid from pure octahedral to the 51 degrees, 51 minutes, which makes the angle necessary for capacitive implosion. And capacitive implosion is the reason pyramids can take the Schumann harmonics and turn that into global wireless power, called longitudinal interferometry. And if you read the book 2/3, David Myers, David Percy, you will see why it was called the Hummer by the ancients, because it was humming.
Thank you. And you also mentioned about the egg shape, and I saw on your slide there is an egg shape where you have the seed growing inside. Why were many sacred buildings built in the shape of an egg? Specifically, sacred buildings.
Yeah, it's a very useful question, actually, and it starts with a simple logic. If you would like to know which human cell is most cancerous, it is when it approaches a sphere. So you measure the cell's tendency to get cancer by when it becomes a sphere. The reason spherical shape defines cancer in human cells is instructive. It starts with the book, not Geometric Extensions of Consciousness, Laws of Form and Structural Stability and Morphogenesis. It's more structural stability and morphogenesis, that the shape of the folded surface of a living cell is obviously simply music. It's a matter of harmonic inclusiveness. So if you take how many different frequencies are included in the wave shape of the surface of that cell, musically, that's called fractality of folded surface, which defines why cell membranes are a brain, as in Bruce Lipton, who's also an old friend. So the harmonic inclusiveness of the cell membrane predicts how much immune system you got. Literally, the same way that the harmonic inclusiveness of your heart rate variability is the fastest way to measure immune health. That harmonic inclusiveness is called get fractal or get dead, whereas when you have the maximum number of harmonics included, that defines fractality and immune health. Well, a sphere is the opposite of harmonic inclusiveness. Oh no, it means that a sphere is basically only one harmonic. Oops, that ain't good for immune health, obviously. So a sphere is the opposite of plasma projective. And the reason that defines cancer musically is because that lack of harmonic inclusiveness and lack of harmonic projection means that the charge is stuck inside. Oops, as in the fact that failure to be inhibited by contact, called contact inhibition, is the primary electrical measurement of cancer. So the fact that a sphere doesn't respond to touch is because the harmonics are not inclusive. So the polar opposite of that would be an egg. An egg takes the contiguous geometry of a sphere and modulates it ideally by golden ratio. And it's in the slideshow, but I won't even dig out the slides now. You can see them all at goldenmean.info/architecture. But the pine cone shape, which is another way to look at an egg, is actually, if you as the biodynamic people did in Laws of Form and Lawrence Edwards' Vortex of Life, Fields of Form, classic biodynamic text, he showed that the tree changes the shape of the pine cone over the year according to how much charge that tree needed to extract from gravity. So the pine cone is a device to take 0-point energy of capacitive implosion from the atmosphere and feed the tree. That's why you can make rain with a pine cone if you've had instruction. It's very cool. But the seeds of a pine cone are capacitor, and the spiral angle of this, as the pine cone breathes over the year, is telling you how the tree is modulating its energy grid. So it's deciding to implode more when it needs more charge. So that is instructive about how an egg works. An egg is basically plasma projective according to the geometry where it points. And that ability to be plasma projective is the definition of the raising of the Jed, or the Jedi, because the Jed refers to the ability to project plasma. So it indicates the possibility of birth and many things. So egg shapes are fabulous for biologic architecture. And there are hundreds of pictures of beautiful buildings of egg shapes from the work of Michael Rice, one of our lead architects from Ireland, at bioarchitects.net. And you can see the pictures there.
Wow, that's really interesting information, especially regarding the projection, right? So the pine or egg can project this energy into outer space. Well, when it comes to a person being inside of such building of an egg shape, what kind of effect this building and its shape has on a person its physical and energetic component?
You know, I noticed in the pictures you sent for the questionnaire, you showed pictures of the churches in Ukraine. And many of those churches, and we'll dig out those pictures, but many of those churches had the classic Eastern Orthodox Catholic, which are onion-shaped domes, which are very much kind of the opposite of the Western Roman Catholic, very needle-shaped, pointy dome towers. And we say, oh, well, why? This would be a way to think about building shape now. Now, I would go back in time to when we were advising a bunch of farmers who found out that after the communication company came to their farm and planted a metal tower on their farm for the communications grid, shortly after that, they realized that the soil all around that metal tower just died. Oh, shit. Omered. And so we were advising farmers of how you collect the legal data to sue the communications company for killing their soil. And we found out a way to do that in court and legally prove it, and it was cheap. It's very simple. You measure what's called soil compaction. So when you measure relative soil compaction in a variety of places, you can measure whether the soil is alive or dead, because there's a bunch of microbes. It's going to be fluffy. And if the microbes die, suddenly it's packed. Oh, merde. And so by measuring the soil compaction under the microwave towers, you could in fact prove in court that whoever put that tower in your farmer's field killed the soil, and you can sue them. Well, now that's very interesting. But oh, what about Catholic churches? Oh, you got a sharp point on those towers. Ooh, is that killing the soil too? And actually, it's similar to acupuncture moxibustion in that if you put sharp needles on an array, you will bleed the charge from one point, which can be therapeutic only if it's part of that array. Whereas an onion-shaped tower is more fractal and therefore more charge conserving and doesn't just squirt and bleed the charge. Now, if the location of the sharp needles itself fits a larger array, that could in itself create a larger body. Like why the Gothic cathedrals make a star map of Virgo, that is creating a body. However, if the sharp needle points are not part of a bigger array, then they're simply death to the soil. Oh dear. So in that sense, the onion-shaped dome of the Eastern churches are a lot more biologic than the sharp points. So this is the beginning of examples. And Michael Rice has a bunch of examples of egg-shaped natural material building where I personally have had many bliss experiences. So the experience fits the physics.
Wow, very interesting. You mentioned about the effect the pointy towers have on the earth, but would it have the same effect on the people? So let's say if people are living next to cathedrals with the pointy peaks or just the towers with the pointy, would they also be affected some kind of with this energy?
Well, that's the thing. So that the land, the fractality of the land is designed to create a bubble of charge, which needs to be alive. Now, if the arrangement of the stone temples fits a larger pattern, then that bubble can itself be a larger, longer wave body. However, when you put sharp pointed towers up and it's not part of the pattern of a bigger body, the squirting capacitance at the peak of that tower is going to bleed. And that is going to weaken the life force of the land. So there are many that say that churches can be parasitic. And if you talk to the most advanced geobiologists on the planet, and I believe the Advanced Geobiology School in Lausanne, Stefan Cardino, goldenmean.info/geobiology, he said that many of the Western churches are in fact occupied by parasites. There's very large plasma parasites in most churches, which are actually big trouble. But you see, the concept of astral hygiene is not simple. So then why do millions of people go to these churches every Sunday if in fact it's a place for an astral parasite to eat their aura? Oh dear. But there's another way of looking at that, in that most people who do not have the skill to have a bliss experience actually need periodically to have their aura eaten. And there's a symbiotic relationship. And this is a complicated question. And astral hygiene is a detailed conversation about maintaining charge in a plasma bubble. And that this introduces very interesting questions about, essentially, if you can teach your kids how to have a bliss experience, then you have culture. If not, you don't. And that is because ability to have bliss or charge radiance defines whether you get the longitudinal coherence called lucid dreaming, which defines who is going to take memory through death, which is the only form immortality takes.
Well, I think it explains why in Netherlands there are a lot of churches being converted into clubs or places for any gala events, rather than actually the religious institution where people go on Sunday to attend.
Actually, our newest Therapy Center in Netherlands, Metal Cathedral, is an old cathedral, actually. And the roof of the cathedral is now a Therapy Plasma Bliss Center. So people intuitively know that the opportunity to implode your plasma, which is to have a bliss experience, is the only time your aura actually gets sorted. And that's why it is biologically essential to learn the skill, the hygiene, to have bliss experiences, because otherwise your aura never gets the climax needed to self-sort. And that's what gets your aura coherent enough. It's called the Ba from the Ka, or the El as in Elohim, or the rainbow light body, or the Kezjan body. These are all names for projecting longitudinal coherence, which determines whether your aura has made that L or phase shift into longitudinal array compressional. And that's what determines if you go into the lucid dream lucidly, which is inhabiting the larger array, heaven, and that predicts whether you take memory at death.
Mm-hmm. We also had the question regarding the instruments that you've been using to collect data, whether it's spherical shape or pyramids that you were studying. What kind of instruments do you use to get this instrumental data?
Well, there's a bit of a history there. So originally, we were working with Stefan Cardinaux, and the geobiologic instruments there were magnetic flux intensity detector. A little background. So then we were using the Kszénia mirror, which is a microwave coherent metal cylinder, which determined whether you achieve commercial telepathy. And the Kszénia mirror placement was acupuncture, earth-wide. And so you didn't get military quality telepathy in a Kszénia mirror. This is all Russian work, very advanced. And our friend, Professor Korotkov, made the measurements, unless you planted it at an acupuncture site on the earth, which is measurable by nanoteslas of magnetic flux density, earth grid magnetic line crosses. And those places determine labyrinths, cathedrals, stone circles, and success for action at a distance, success for telepathy, and better effect with Therapy. And all the devices work better at magnetic line crosses. And by the way, the same thing applies to sunrise, sunset, all four-wave mixing. So we needed to measure these magnetic lines. So we were using the nanotesla geobiology instruments, goldenmean.info/geobiology. And then we realized that a correlate was capacitive harmonic inclusiveness. Effectively, how many frequencies is held in the weak charge envelope? So Korotkov, for example, famously followed the Kogi to where they made phone calls to ancestors and then measured what he called the fractality of the air, and correlated and proved that phone calls to ancestors are only possible where air is fractal. You can see all that at goldenmean.info/architecture. Well, it turns out, we had long discussions about this, that what he was measuring effectively was charge distribution efficiency, what I just showed you before. Now, we needed a better way to measure that. And that's where we come to our tool, flameinmind.com. We took the brainwave sensor we used to measure bliss, which can spectrum analyze a microvolt, the brainwave, and we measure a tree. And we can measure whether Schumann harmonics are present, and therefore which tree is alive or dead. And then we do the same. We can tell whether a building is alive or dead. So basically, a tree is going to die if it doesn't get the Schumann harmonics because it can't implode capacitance. And I learned this from Professor Phil Callahan famously, and it's a bit of a long story. He was using a biologic transducer based on hemp. And so we learned to use the brainwave preamplifier first in my original Bliss tuner, and now famously with flameinmind.com, which is a brainwave preamplifier based on the Muse system that uses a spectrum analyzer software that we wrote to measure life force. And that's how we measured life force in the pyramids with Sam in Bosnia and elsewhere in buildings. So we measure whether the center of that egg shape or the center of a building, or whether the center of a bamboo versus a steel building. And we measure how many harmonics of the weak charge are present. And that cascade will tell us whether that building is imploding. Exactly the same way we can tell which brain is having bliss. and then we're able to measure life force in buildings.
Thank you so much. And since we're talking about Schumann frequency and the buildings, is there any connection between the shape of the building and the Schumann frequency? You partially answered, but yeah, maybe have additional information.
Yeah, one very practical way to think about the shape versus the function of the building. When I did my first lecture series in Florence with Bucky Fuller, it was sponsored by Gus Giacacci. And Gus had a farm on which he built his building was the shape of one ladder rung of DNA. And I don't know if you know what that looks like, but one rung on the ladder of DNA is a hex, a pent, and then a golden ratio rectangle on each side. So the sugar of the codon is actually hex, pent, and golden ratio rectangle, hex, pent. And that's one rung on the ladder of DNA. And the top-down view was Gus Giacacci's farmhouse. Now, it turns out that in the pent shape, you could experience a shareable wave. That was a place for plasma projection and implosion and bliss. And it was a place for no secrets. Versus in the hex, that was perfect for privacy and charge stability and stasis and crystallization and lack of implosion. A hex versus a pent, a witch could tell you very well which is which. I don't know if you can wiggle your nose, I'm not sure. But the difference between a hex and a pent for witchcraft is very instructive to architects. The hex is what fixes the spell, and the pent's what sends it. And what they meant by that was the hex is a top-down view of a cube, which generates square root of 2 harmonics, the octave, which is perfect for maximum charge destructive interference, perfect for freezing hex snowflakes, which is excellent for stabilizing and terrible for distribution. So a hex will stabilize and fix, whereas a pent will implode and send. It turns out that your aura uses that principle. It's called Merkaba flower of life. First, you visualize star tetra Merkaba, and the two imploding opposing tetra spinning around your body is essentially cubic, and that's creating a crystal implosive. It's literally freezing your aura for stability, but it is not imploding or sending at all. But then when you're ready and you feel like you're ready for no secrets and bliss and death, meaning you've processed your emotions and you've distilled all of life's experience to a pure principle, and you're not angry at anybody, then you're ready to implode without getting dizzy. Then you tilt your head 32 degrees, the chin angle of the Sphinx, and that's how you rotate a cube and blink 5 times, and you have a pent dodeca. And so you visualize that, and then your visualization goes from hex to pent, and that's implosive, and that's charge distribution, and you will come back dizzy if you were not ready to be a shareable wave.
In fact, buildings can make people feel dizzy or influence people's energies, right? And what connecting it with what you said in the very beginning, that the pines of certain shape can have pointy point somewhere and kind of send information. Do you think people who actually gathering under this dome whether it's pointy or onion shape or just a sphere, half of a sphere, can their energy be collected and go somewhere else from under the dome?
Well, that's the right question. I mean, in my intuition, your question is very close to the question of how do you prepare a group to lucid dream together? Normally, before we lucid dream, we notice that our aura has become coherent. A lot of times that means people will have had access to bliss, so their aura becomes charged enough, El as in Elohim. And so if they're using structures for bliss, like churches and temples, and doing bliss ritual like Sufi dancing, generally, if you want to lucid dream as a group, there's another step. Very important because, carry Mother Nature's silver seed to a new heart in the sun. In generally, unless we can collectively lucid dream through the heart of the sun, there's probably no way out of here. So this could be relatively important information. But it is said, the sort of poetry around this is, well, you get together once or twice a week and you have sacred dance and yoga and prayer and meditation and dinner, and then you laugh and cry with and for each other until you feel each other's pain every time as if it was your own. Then you're bonded enough to lucid dream as a group. And if you've done that skillfully, the power of that lucid dream as a group can save a planet from interstellar astral parasites and is desperately required for this planet to have astral hygiene.
Okay. I would like to also explain a little bit about that picture, the very last one we see. If you could open the file with our questions, the very last picture, the question number 9, it is actually the picture of Saint-Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv. And yeah, basically what you see over there is its original shape, which you can see it looks kind of like a pyramid, and the domes are spherical shape. But then later in the 18th century,
the last one, if you scroll down a little bit more, excuse me. Yes, the last one. You see black and white, it's structure, the last one. Yes, you see
that was the original structure. Original structure from 10th, 11th century was a pyramid-shaped building with domes of half a sphere, like almost perfectly spherical domes. And then later, in medieval times, it was changed to Baroque style. They rebuilt it and they added those onion-looking domes, and they changed the shape of the building from a pyramid to just, I don't know, just a building.
Pointy.
Pointy, yeah, making it more pointy.
Right, right. Yes, and notably used gold, correct?
Yes, they use very thin gold layers to cover it.
Actually,
so what do you think is the difference between these two structures in the way they operate, from biological architecture or the sacred geometry, or kind of like energetical structures? What would be the difference between these two buildings?
That's a very fascinating question.
So could you please, yes, if you speak, then please come back to us without sharing the screen, because then we don't see your face.
Okay.
Oh yeah, we would like to see see you back when you stop sharing.
But just before I do that, so on top here, though, those more spherical top is the old shape on top. Is that right?
And yes.
And the middle one here is the present shape, which has the recursive onions on top. I get it. Okay. Yes. Okay. Well, let's discuss that. So first, let me say that the spherical shape is more charge containing. So that would be more, it would stabilize the aura. It would hold it in place. It would not be as plasma projective. Now, if you add the layers on top, which is like the recursive onion domes that were added, and they were added in a geometric sequence that made it coherently plasma projective, that could be quite useful. it would very much depend on where that squirt gun was pointed. I would say one other thing, and that is the use of gold on that surface is actually incredibly powerful, because the thin film of gold, if the dome shape is even reasonably accurate, is an incredibly powerful implosive capacitor, because the thin film of gold under the right conditions can contribute to what's called a phase conjugate array. So the choice of gold there is actually potentially quite powerful. And we could, in fact, measure beautifully the capacitance under that dome and prove what I'm saying. It should be harmonic inclusive. So the theory would be that when they changed it to a half sphere, to a cascade of onion domes, the harmonics went from harmonic exclusive to more harmonic inclusive in a directional array that was actually coherent, was pointing meaningfully. So it's kind of like saying, is there a way to send my prayers to heaven? So in fact, this was an indication they were ready to share their bliss, would be a subjective way of talking about it, and potentially quite useful.
Oh, thank you.
Interesting. Yes, because you mentioned that if we put people in a metal, then it's actually blocking. But if it's a gold and thin layer, yes, you said that it's different technique.
Well, that's right. Actually, we have a table of metals in terms of which one are bad and good for life force. In that table of metals, probably the most poisonous is aluminum, and then bad is steel. A little better is iron, a little better is copper, better is silver, and best is gold, obviously. And titanium is not too bad, too, but it's a bit of a long story. But essentially, if you want to make capacitance implode, use what's called a phase conjugate array. So a thin film of gold in the right array is amazing. And actually, just to make that point, if you look at the health statistics of people who work in aluminum foil plant, you discover disaster. Because you see, the molecules, the atoms in the aluminum have been frozen from the bauxite with a high amperage electric current, which was highly synthetic. So those atoms have been isolated from charge distribution. So I tell you, the atoms in that aluminum are literally in pain. And the clairvoyants from occult chemistry were able to see that. And the pain of the atoms in that aluminum is reflected when you live in aluminum buildings. It is pain for your aura. Pain is defined as charge that's bleeding from lack of fractality, not able to compress. And gold, you see, is the opposite of that. That actually invites charge distribution. So there's a deep physics behind this. And it was actually documented by the clairvoyants in occult chemistry. Long story.
Wow. And one more question regarding the original spherical shape. You said that it's more stabilized, and could you elaborate a little bit more about the effect it would have on people who are affected by spherical shape, which is?
Yeah, we started a community in North Carolina called the Circle of Life, and we installed Bucky Fuller, who was a good friend of mine's, geodesic dome. And that spherical dome was one of the most geopathic seed-killing structures I have ever been in. That was a sphere. And our friends in France, one of them built a sphere and moved in and literally went nuts, man. I swear, the guy went insane, literally. And the reason is very simple, because your charge cannot breathe or be distributed. It is charge isolation, which is why nature will never use a sphere for about anything except maybe an eyeball. Other than that, you ain't going to find spheres in nature, because Mother Nature knows that isolated charge ain't a good thing.
Okay. So knowing this knowledge, if we would actually use it for our society in a certain way, how do you think that would change our approach to architecture, building structures, if that would be actually considered when we develop in our cities and so on?
It's a whole different thing, man. I mean, it means whoever invented present cities should apologize. They're killing us oh, merde. No, when we got to Prague and we have the pictures, the magnetic map is a rose. And I was able to lucid dream there, which for me, that was pretty good. So if the magnetic map is a rose, then you have the possibility of life. So basically, cities would look like biology. It's obvious. Now, when we put in geobiology, we make magnetic lines into an array. There's an example from Oldrich Hosman, who was one of our great biologic architects from Prague. You can see it at bioarchitects.net, bioarch.cz. And he followed a shaman who took the magnetic lines of a very important town in Czechoslovakia, and they put colored living bricks to map where the magnetic lines cross the center of the town. So now suddenly children are taking a walk across the center of town, and they're actually walking on a map of the real living lucid dreaming magnetic lines. This is life. And so when these magnetic lines are respected, song line, dreaming track, you get life, you get lucid dreaming, you get charge distribution. But first, we got to ditch most of the steel and aluminum and almost all of the electrosmog. So sorry, guys, you need to start over pretty quick if you want your kids to have a soul. That's my opinion.
Wow, thank you so much. It's very interesting. And you mentioned that the Prague and the rose, it's like because the city itself is built as a rose shape.
The pictures are all over the website at goldenmean.info/architecture. Basically, there's a myth. It has to do with King Rudolph and the alchemist quarter at the center of Prague, but it's actually literally true. You can see the original map of Prague is literally a rose. Now, you know, it means that whoever designed that happened to have seen my bumper sticker, which says get fractal or get dead. No, it means that if the magnetic geometry invites charge distribution, that's why when we said, well, how do you do biologic architecture? It's very simple. If you can't feel a magnetic line, probably you're dead anyway. But if you can, then make a magnetic map first of your bed. And our friend used to make a magnetic map of everybody's bed, and he could always tell in advance who was sick. All right. So make a magnetic map of your bed, and then your house, and then your garden, and then your town, and rearrange all of them to look like a rose, and you're done.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the tips on how to improve your well-being, at least while we are still
the more you have access to bliss, that buzz, that charge implodes your DNA, and your DNA becomes more and more conductive. So you do your bliss dance and your rituals and your yoga. And eventually, every time you walk over a magnetic line and you relax, your hair stands up because your blood is more implosive, and you're feeling the blood of the Mother Earth. And so as you begin to become sensitive to those magnetic lines, you can become helpful in tuning them. And that's why they were called dreaming track and songline. And it has everything to do with health and shamanic power.
Since you touched upon dances and you mentioned Sufi dances earlier, does it matter in which direction they spin? Or because spinning is also part that we see in rituals around the world, whether it's Buddhist walking around stupa, they have majority walking clockwise, but there are small groups like Bon who decided to go counterclockwise. We know that in Christianity, it was also tradition to walk around temples clockwise, but then in medieval times, they switched it to counterclockwise. Same story with Sufi dances. So does it actually matter in which direction do people spin or walk around their sacred temples?
It's a lovely question. I think I'd like to invite you to recognize that this is a hard question. And the way you can realize that this is a hard question is if you ask a biophysicist why every single living protein helical stairway goes one way only, they don't have a clue. So please recognize that you have just asked a hard question. Now, if I may say, one of the best hypotheses around that is the DC polarity of lightning does vary, but it is dominant in one direction. And it turns out that it's called the enantiomorphism, helical handedness of lightning, that the direction of the helix, which is more centripetal, is the necessary direction. If you recognize, here's the proteins that made life out of primal soup. So if the stirring agent is this lightning, if the lightning is centrifugal, it's going to blow them apart. Whereas if it's centripetal, so that allows you to then begin to think about the direction of polarity of helicity, which produces the centripetal force, which is life. Now, I believe the Sufis did counterclockwise. And if you look at the operations, the centripetal direction would be called grounding. The centrifugal direction would be called bliss or radiance, or unpacking versus packing. So we have many names for this, plus and minus charge, yin and yang, but actually the physics is only the difference between centripetal and centrifugal. And I would speculate that on most planets, the helical, the DC polarity of the lightning that stirred the primal soup on that planet that happened to be centripetal will then determine the enantiomorphic helicity of the one direction only, called up the down staircase of every single living protein on the planet spins one way only. Maybe we need an answer. The answer is get centripetal or get dead.
I see. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think you answered all our questions, and maybe you have something to add to our viewers, or to wish them, or to talk about your recent projects and encourage our viewers to get familiar with more of your information.
Well, thank you for inviting me. We had some fun today. As everyone knows, so our Therify.net is our global living plasma rejuvenation project based on implosion, and the flameinmind.com is the brainwave spectrum analysis for bliss training, and we have an inexpensive bliss binaural there, and then the imploder.com for making life force in water, our educational outreach project at fractalfield.com, my contact info at fractalfield.com, our YouTube channel with 2 million views, Dan Winter Fractal Field. I would just say in closing that it might be the most important decision we ever make for ourselves and our children, that we're going to follow the advice which said, follow your bliss. Essentially what that meant was, every action you take every day determines whether you're attracting charge, who you hug, and which broccoli you pick, genetic diversity. And eventually, if you make 1 billion decisions right, you get enough aura to take memory through death. And that is the caduceus that Enki is back to teach. That is the hermetically sealed caduceus, which today is called phase conjugation. That's implosion, that's fractality, and that is the science of life.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure to have you as a guest, and yes, we had fun indeed today.
Thank you. Hope to see you again. Blessings.
Thank you so much.
Likewise.
Nice to meet you. Bye-bye. Let's stay in touch.
Yeah. Before we disconnect, I would like to say that our Kaleidoscopes of Facts, they come out in 15 languages at least. So we're gonna have Allatra TV channel. You can look it up. We have multiple languages, multiple countries participating. Our Russian-speaking channel, original one, just surpassed 400,000 subscribers yesterday. So it's gonna be a lot of exposure to different countries. Our Spanish-speaking one is developing, so don't be surprised to get some questions from South America.
Well, you know, about the Russians, when we did the spiral on the torus and showed the spin angles, created the shadows of Hebrew and Sanskrit, we also showed the origins of Cyrillic Russian. If you just look on the spiral on the torus from the right views, you get Russian Cyrillic. Talk about sacred. It's fun.
Wow.
Goldenmean.info/DNA ring. It's Russian.
You see how everything is interconnected. Thank you so much.
Blessings.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Talk
Nice
to
to
you
meet you.
soon. Bye-bye.